Hey everyone, thank you for joining us today for our webinar on 2025 carbon management legislation. I'm Emma Tomley. I'm a policy specialist on the Great Plains Institute's Industrial Innovation and Carbon Management team. For those of you who don't know us at GPI, the Great Plains Institute is a nonpartisan nonprofit dedicated to accelerating the transition to net zero carbon emissions for the benefit of people, the economy, and the environment. Today, I'm joined by my colleague, Alana Hadland, Program Coordinator for our Industrial Innovation Initiative, who also does a large chunk of our legislative tracking. You should tune in to our hydrogen and procurement webinars in the next couple of weeks. But today, she will be helping me with Q&A and slides. One note is that we'll be recording today's webinar and we'll plan to share it with everyone in the coming weeks. Next. All right, so before we get started, I just want to quickly walk through what we're going to cover today. I'm going to start by zooming out to look at the legislative landscape, including some context on recent trends and where activity is showing up across states. After that, I'll spend a moment explaining how we approached the webinar and how we grouped different types of legislation. The bulk of today's webinar is going to be focusing on carbon management policy trends, walking through what states were most focused on in 2025 and how those policies are showing up across a number of categories, including governance and regulatory readiness, infrastructure and deployment, enablement and constraints, community, landowner, and environmental protections, technology eligibility, and market formation and incentives. So I'll pull all of those threads together with a few cross-cutting takeaways and then share some early signals we're watching as states head into 2026 sessions. And then finally, I'm going to wrap up with a quick overview of our legislative resources and leave, hopefully, plenty of time for questions. We're planning to hold that formal Q&A at the end today, but please feel free to drop questions in the chat as we go. Next. Okay, well, diving right in, here on this chart, you can see the carbon management bills that we've been tracking, and that number has steadily increased over the past few years, with that trend continuing on into 2025. I always joke that part of this is just that my bill tracking has gotten significantly better, but there are also some real structural reasons that we're likely seeing this growth. So, carbon management is continuing to move from a niche policy area into a broader set of legislative conversations. As projects become more tangible and more visible, legislators are engaging not just with whether carbon management should happen, but how it should be regulated, who bears that risk, and how communities are protected. That naturally produces a lot more bills. We're also seeing a lot of issue clustering in several states. Multiple bills are being introduced that address very similar concerns. That doesn't necessarily mean there's consensus on those issues or each bill is exactly the same, but it does signal that certain questions like eminent domain, liability, or local control are rising to the top and drawing attention from multiple lawmakers at once. Related to that, introducing a bill can also function as a signal in a policy space like carbon management that's still evolving. Bills are sometimes used to elevate concerns, shape the conversation, or test ideas, even if they're not expected to move all the way through the process that year. It's also important to note that not all states are starting from the same place. Some states enacted foundational legislation in the late 2000s and are now refining that existing regulation, those existing regulations, while others have just recently joined the conversation. Finally, one more note on this chart is that the gap between considered and enacted bills is telling. While interest is clearly growing, enactment remains more selective, and legislatures are still working through how to balance economic opportunity, infrastructure development, and public trust. So, overall, the increase in bills reflects not just momentum, but a policy area that's still being defined, stress tested, and refined across states. Next. Okay, so this map shows where carbon management legislation appeared across states in 2025. In total, 36 states considered legislation, and there's no clear single regional pattern here, but you can see just how many states are engaging on this during the year. Some states introduced only one or two bills, while others introduced five to eight or more. Where higher concentrations appear, they tend to be in states that have active or proposed carbon management infrastructure, including parts of the Plains and Upper Midwest, the Gulf Coast, and several industrial states. I do want to point out that Louisiana is a clear outlier here with 33 bills introduced in 2025, roughly triple that of the next highest state, which was North Dakota. But in Louisiana and other higher activity states, this activity again reflects where projects are proposed, more visible, or contested, which tends to generate proposals across a wider range of policy areas. Next slide. Okay, so after looking at how many bills were introduced and enacted and in what states those bills are being introduced in, this slide shifts the lens to what states we're trying to accomplish with all of that activity. So instead of treating each bill as a standalone item, although I know everyone would love to hear me go down a list of 160 bills, we grouped them into a small set of policy buckets based on the main objectives states were pursuing in 2025 through those bills, like building regulatory readiness, enabling infrastructure, shaping markets, managing long-term risk and liability, technology scope and eligibility, or addressing environmental and community concerns. It's important to note that many bills don't fit neatly into just one bucket. Comprehensive framework bills often touch on several of those topic areas at once. So a single bill might establish regulatory authority, address long-term liability, enable storage deployment, and include community protections. And rather than forcing those bills into one category, this approach helps show how those goals are intertwined and how states are often trying to move multiple pieces forward in parallel. So if you hear some bills mentioned twice today, that's why. But with that framing in mind, we can dive into our first topic area, which is market formation and incentives. Thanks, Alana. So this is the first section where we really start talking about bills. So I want to briefly frame how states are approaching this space. Market formation and incentive policies focus on making carbon management more financially viable. Rather than addressing permitting or safety, these bills shape the financial and market conditions that determine whether projects are viable, investable, and competitive. So across states, these projects are being used to improve project economics, create or expand demand for low carbon fuels, power, and industrial projects, reducing early stage financial or policy risk, and clarifying how carbon management can qualify for existing clean energy or fuel incentives. We saw 28 of these bills introduced in 2025, but only two were enacted. Overall, that pattern isn't surprising. States did not make widespread moves towards large direct subsidy programs or deployment mandates, and are testing out different ideas for how to incentivize carbon management. Next. Okay, so our first subcategory within market incentives focuses on direct financial incentives. So these are policies that provide pretty explicit value tied to the performance or deployment of carbon management technologies. And we saw a fairly narrow set of incentive tools in 2025. Proposals took the form of targeted tax credits for low carbon fuels or industrial production, per ton incentives for CO2 storage or utilization, and property severance or production tax relief for qualifying equipment. On the right, you can see a range of approaches states explored this year. That includes Wyoming's enacted enhanced oil recovery stimulus program, North Dakota's low carbon fuels fund, and proposed production and fuel tax credits in states like Georgia, New Mexico, Kentucky, and Louisiana. One thing that stands out here is enactment. The two enacted examples you see here, Wyoming and North Dakota, are not just enacted within this subcategory, they're the only enacted bills across all market formation and incentives legislation in 2025. Both are in states with Class 6 primacy and have established carbon management frameworks, suggesting that states that already have regulatory certainty and active interest in deployment may be the ones most likely to pass incentives in the future. Next. Okay, the second market formation subcategory focuses on market access and eligibility rules. These policies don't directly fund carbon management projects, but they shape the conditions under which projects can qualify for existing incentives, standards, or clean energy markets. In 2025, most of this activity showed up through life cycle emissions accounting, and rather than naming specific technologies, states focused on emissions performance, where carbon capture becomes one possible pathway to meet emissions thresholds for things like sustainable aviation fuel, tax credits, clean fuel standards, or low carbon electricity definitions. It's not required and it's not automatically eligible. It has to demonstrate emissions reductions. And many of the examples here are tied to sustainable aviation fuel. Compared to 2024, we saw more bills focused on sustainable aviation fuel eligibility and accounting rules, especially bills clarifying how captured carbon or carbon-derived fuels fit into existing SAF programs. So definitely something to keep an eye on for 2026, even though none of those bills were enacted. Next slide. Okay, risk mitigation and cost recovery. So these policies aren't primarily about incentivizing new projects, but about reducing uncertainty and managing financial exposure once projects move closer to deployment. And in practice, these are policies that are clarifying whether and how carbon capture investments can be recovered through utility rates, protect developers from policy changes that could strand investments, or expand financing authority for storage and transport infrastructure. And the examples here reflect that focus. We see rate-making eligibility for carbon capture in Iowa, a targeted tax credit in Louisiana, and that one specifically is designed to address stranded Class 6 well investments, and then expanded financing authority for storage infrastructure in Texas. Compared to those other market categories I went through today, that category is smaller. But again, we're seeing those bills pop up in states where projects are more advanced and the capital exposure for projects is already real. And again, none of these were enacted. Next. All right, the final market formation subcategory looks at state-created markets and enablement. These bills reflect a more active potential role for states, either by proposing direct demand for verified carbon removal or emissions reductions, or by investing public resources to determine whether new markets are viable at all. And in practice, this includes proposals for state purchasing programs, grant programs, or dedicated funds supported by taxes or fees, as well as public investment in feasibility, engineering, or workforce studies. And the examples here illustrate that range. California's proposal would have made the state a buyer of durable carbon removal. Pennsylvania's cap and invest proposal would direct auction revenue towards carbon capture and workforce development. Louisiana storage-related tax proposals, which are a little different, would increase costs for storage operators and function more as cost allocation mechanisms rather than incentives. I included them here because they directly shape storage economics rather than permitting or safety. And then Minnesota's proposal sits at the enablement end of the spectrum, with the state proposing to fund an analysis to assess whether producing sustainable aviation fuel from carbon capture is economically viable. And again, none of these bills were enacted, but it reinforces the broader pattern that states are still testing different approaches and haven't yet settled on when or how to take a direct role in supporting carbon management in this way. Next slide. All right, just one slide here for technology scope and eligibility. Once states start defining those markets, incentives, and regulatory frameworks, the next question becomes which technologies are actually eligible to participate? And in 2025, we saw a lot of meaningful activity around technology scope and eligibility, essentially how states define carbon management technologies and decide that they qualify for those different programs or incentives. I do want to note that these provisions were rarely the main focus of a bill. More often, they appeared within broader legislation on tax incentives, permitting, or planning. But I do want to note that those are often areas where those really small definitional changes can have outsized impacts. For example, making a technology eligible for funding credits or regulatory treatment it didn't previously qualify for. And states took different approaches to how they drew those lines. Some bills avoided naming specific technologies altogether and instead focused on functional outcomes, such as permanent geologic storage, measurable life cycle emissions reductions, or verified capture and containment. And approaches like that allowed carbon capture, direct air capture, and different types of carbon removal and other hybrid pathways to qualify without being explicitly listed, giving regulators flexibility as technologies evolve. We saw a lot of bills related to life cycle emissions accounting with eligibility tied to net emissions performance. Again, saw a lot of bills related to sustainable aviation fuel, clean fuel standards, clean energy definitions, where carbon capture wasn't the wasn't inherently eligible for any of those, but just one possible pathway that could demonstrate emissions performance. So we saw 24 bills in this area. Again, not a lot of enactment, only one was enacted, which makes sense since most of the provisions related to eligibility were tied to those market and incentives related bills that I was talking about earlier. Next slide. Okay, on to infrastructure and deployment enablement. So this category captures bills that focus on the practical conditions needed to actually build projects. Across the 20 bills we tracked here in 2025, states used a few different levers to enable deployment. One lever is removing barriers that prevent infrastructure from moving forward. California is a good example on pipelines, where the state extended safety and permitting authority to intrastate CO2 pipelines and lifted a pause that had effectively blocked development. A second lever is site readiness and access. West Virginia expanded the ability to lease state-managed pore space under state parks, and Indiana created clearer pathways for site characterization and well conversion, paired with a fee-funded program with administration and monitoring. A third lever here is clarifying permitting pathways and regulatory capacity. This one includes not just timelines and authority, but also long-term stewardship and post-closure responsibility that I'll talk more about later. But Arkansas and Colorado are included here because clarifying who is responsible over the long term can reduce uncertainty during permitting and making projects easier to finance up front. Finally, some of these bills that enabled infrastructure and deployment focus on financing and pre-development planning, including tools to support demonstrations, site assessments, and capital access. These policies are typically aiming to reduce early stage risk rather than directly subsidize deployment. But the through line through all of these different approaches is enablement and states that are focusing on the conditions needed for projects to proceed. And they're just doing it in a variety of ways. And we can see already that this was one of the more actionable categories in 2025. While not all of these bills advanced, a meaningful share were enacted or took effect, particularly in those states that already have active or emerging carbon management frameworks. Next. Okay, so to balance that enablement picture that I just showed you, we also tracked a smaller group of bills that introduced constraints on infrastructure and deployment. Many of these bills also appear elsewhere in this presentation, but we're pulling them out here because if enacted, they would have an outsized impact on the pace or feasibility of deployment, even when they're motivated by safety, landowner rights, or local control. These bills were much less common than the enablement measures I just showed you, and most of them weren't enacted in 2025. But where they did appear, they typically introduced conditions, pauses, or siting limits rather than outright reversals of carbon management policy. For example, in South Dakota, proposed a temporary moratorium on carbon dioxide pipeline construction until updated federal safety rules are finalized. In Iowa, proposed legislation would limit how long pipeline permits can be renewed, effectively capping operational lifespans. Illinois enacted a geographic exclusion for carbon storage infrastructure near sole source aquifers, and Louisiana considered a time-limited moratorium on storage and related permitting, and several county-related bills in the state would have allowed counties to approve or prohibit projects if desired. Overall, these bills highlight where states are exercising caution or seeking additional information. We saw these bills increase from 2023 to 2024 and now into 2025, and they're likely going to continue to be introduced in 2026 alongside other deployment-focused legislation as we hear more about projects. Next slide. Alrighty, so this section looks at long-term risk and liability. As carbon management projects are moving from concept to operation, states are continuing to grapple with who is responsible not just during deployment, but decades later. In 2025, we saw states take up these questions in two very different ways. Some focused on long-term stewardship, creating clear rules for when liability transfers from operators to the state, and how much long-term monitoring is funded. Others looked at what happens if something goes wrong, and proposed new compensation, disaster response, and liability mechanisms. Next slide. Okay, so this first group of bills focuses on the long-term stewardship and liability portion, and they attempt to answer a fundamental question for carbon storage projects: who is responsible decades after injection stops, or who is responsible after project closure? In 2025, we saw several states enact relevant comprehensive frameworks in this area. Arkansas, Colorado, New Mexico, and Oklahoma all adopted models where operators pay per ton fees during injection and where the state plays a defined role after the post-closure monitoring period. Where these bills start to differ is in how much of a risk states are willing to take on and how quickly. Some states, like Colorado and New Mexico, allow responsibility to shift relatively soon in terms of years after a certificate of closure, assuming that those monitoring and performance standards are met. Others, like Oklahoma this year, require much longer post-injection monitoring periods, with Oklahoma requiring up to 50 years before the state steps in. It's also worth noting that not all state rules look the same. In some cases, including in Arkansas, that framework focuses on state-funded long-term stewardship and remediation after closure, but does not explicitly transfer or extinguish long-term liability for operators. And that distinction matters for how much certainty operators and financiers ultimately have in different states. But I think we can say overall, this is one of the clearest areas where when comprehensive bills were introduced in a state, they were more likely to be enacted. Next. All right, then the second group of bills focuses on a different type of liability, post-incident liability and disaster response. These policies are less about the long-term stewardship of a site and more about what happens immediately if something goes wrong. Many of these bills emerged in states experiencing active pipeline development or public controversy. They propose strict liability standards, disaster relief funds, or lien mechanisms designed to ensure that compensation is available even if operators face financial distress. But notably, none of those proposals were enacted in 2025, which contrasts sharply with the stewardship frameworks that we were just discussing. And suggests that while legislatures are willing to clarify long-term responsibility in relation to projects, they're more hesitant right now to adopt those aggressive post-incident liability regimes. But still, the volume of these bills matter. And even without enactment, they signal where political pressure is building and the kinds of questions states may continue to revisit as infrastructure expands. Next. All right, community landowner and environmental protections. This next section is one of the broadest categories that we saw in 2025. In total, there are 55 bills that touch this space, and that breadth matters because these bills are not about a single issue. They range from landowner consent and eminent domain limits to pipeline safety, emergency preparedness, and groundwater and aquifer protections, as well as local control, public participation, and procedural safeguards. We also see bills focused on compensation, damages, and post-incident remedies, as well as community benefits and revenue sharing. So, a lot to unpack here. But altogether, these bills show that many legislatures are engaging with carbon management through a community impact lens, even when they're not advancing incentives or deployment policies. And this section is really about how states or state legislatures are exploring how to define the conditions under which projects earn trust, reduce risk, and move forward. Next slide. All right, starting out strong with landowner consent, eminent domain limits, and acquisition. This is one of the most active areas within the category, and these bills are concerned with how carbon infrastructure gains access to private land and the conditions under which landowners can be compelled or not compelled to participate. Across states, we're seeing some similarities in the bills that are introduced, with bills prohibiting the use of eminent domain entirely for carbon dioxide pipelines, others only allowing eminent domain only after developers demonstrate a high level of voluntary easement acquisition, which that one would effectively raise the threshold for compulsory land access. We're also seeing proposals that regulate how developers interact with landowners, including limits on deceptive or coercive practices and clearer disclosure requirements during negotiations. However, in terms of the outcomes for the bills in this category, only one bill was enacted. South Dakota enacted a prohibition on the use of eminent domain for carbon oxide pipelines. It's also important to note that Iowa did pass a bill tightening eminent domain and common carrier standards for CO2 pipelines, but that bill was ultimately vetoed. But I think we can see that this pattern highlights the level of legislative attention on land issues and the lack of consensus on how far those restrictions should go. But if enacted, all of these bills would shift leverage towards landowner and local communities, and could materially affect project siting and timelines. But the fact that most remained proposals in 2026 continues to show just how contested these questions are. And I think we will see more bills like this year. Next slide. All right. We're also seeing more bills that focus on what happens when something goes wrong. Rather than debating whether carbon infrastructure should be built, these proposals are asking what safety standards apply, how communities are notified, and who's responsible if there's an incident. Over the past couple of years, we're seeing more bills like these arise in response to concerns about pipeline incidents and the permitting process. And we're seeing a notable concentration of these bills specifically in the Midwest and the Gulf Coast, particularly in states like Iowa, South Dakota, and Louisiana. Again, the places where proposed CO2 pipelines and storage projects are most active. Across states, these bills are taking a few different forms. Some would expand or clarify state authority to regulate CO2 pipelines rather than waiting for federal safety rules to be finalized. Others would require developers to submit detailed emergency response plans, coordinate directly with local first responders, and share safety information with affected communities before operations begin. A consistent theme for this category in particular is preparedness. If enacted, many of these bills would have required operators to fund training, equipment, or planning, particularly when local emergency responders lack the capacity to handle a CO2 incident. This shifts responsibility away from counties and municipalities and would have placed it on project developers. In terms of status and enactment, California enacted a significant expansion of its pipeline safety authority this year to include interstate pipelines and establish a carbon dioxide pipeline safety advisory committee. In Louisiana, enacted new public safety and reporting requirements for carbon dioxide storage. Most of the other bills in this subcategory remain proposals. But again, from an implication standpoint, if these policies were enacted more broadly, they would likely end up increasing upfront compliance costs. But at the same time, they reflect an effort from state legislatures to address safety concerns and avoid being caught unprepared if an incident were to occur. Next slide. This subcategory focuses on groundwater and aquifer protections, and it reflects a more precautionary approach to carbon storage policy. These bills are less about land access or emergency response and more about where carbon storage shouldn't occur or what additional conditions must be met to protect drinking water resources. Across states, we're seeing a few consistent approaches. Some proposals would prohibit carbon storage activities near sole source aquifers altogether. Others would expand groundwater monitoring, remediation obligations, and environmental review requirements tied to storage projects. We're also seeing state-led studies that aim to better understand subsurface conditions before any large-scale deployment occurs. As far as enactment goes for this category, Illinois enacted a bill this year that created new protections for the Mahomet Aquifer, which is a sole source aquifer, and established a long-term advisory commission to study carbon storage risks. From an implication standpoint, if enacted more broadly across states, bills like these ones would likely place clear geographic and technical constraints on where carbon storage can occur. They increase certainty around water protection, but in general may narrow the viable set of potential storage locations. And I think the most important takeaway here is that it's signaling that groundwater protection in general is emerging as a condition for public acceptance in some areas for carbon storage projects. Next. All right, this category focuses on local control, public participation, and procedural rights. These bills are less about technical standards and more about who gets a voice when decisions are made and where authority ultimately sits in the permitting process. So there are several ways legislatures are strengthening local involvement. Some bills require state regulators to give substantial weight to comments from local governments during carbon storage reviews, such as a Louisiana bill that was enacted this year. Others expand procedural protections, such as requiring hearings to be held locally, strengthening notice requirements for affected landowners, or clarifying disclosure obligations during property transactions. We also see a few proposals, particularly in Louisiana, that go further by giving local governments that would give local governments direct authority to approve or prohibit certain projects, particularly Class 6 injection wells, through ordinances, resolutions, or even parish-wide elections. Next slide. Okay, I wanted to touch briefly on mineral rights and subsurface conflict management, which are bills that are addressing how carbon storage projects interact with existing mineral ownership and extraction activities, particularly oil, gas, and coal. Across states, we see continual efforts to clarify who owns the pore space, how storage units are formed, and what level of consent is required from surface and mineral owners. Some bills condition storage permits on demonstrating that projects will not interfere with active or future mineral production. Others strengthen compensation standards or restrict unitization unless mineral owners agree. None of these bills were enacted, but their presence shows that legislatures are actively engaging with these issues as storage proposals move closer to existing extraction activity. Next slide. All right. This final subcategory focuses on community benefits and revenue sharing. These bills are concerned with how communities hosting carbon infrastructure share in the economic impacts, particularly when projects affect land use, public services, or local risk. And we're seeing a few different approaches. Some bills dedicate a portion of carbon storage or pipeline revenue directly to host communities. Others propose per ton or per mile taxes on storage or transport, with revenue earmarked for public safety, infrastructure, or environmental mitigation projects. Louisiana enacted a clear example this year, dedicating a share of CO2 related revenue on certain state lands to local parishes, but most other proposals remain at the introduced stage. Next. All right, flying through to our last main category here, governance and regulatory readiness. This is one of the broadest categories we tracked in 2025, and it's fairly obvious. It's because governance shows up everywhere. It includes bills about who regulates projects, how permits are issued, how agencies are funded, how risks are managed over time, and how decisions are coordinated across levels of government. And overall, these bills reflect legislatures working through foundational questions like who is in charge, what tools agencies need, and how decisions are going to be made as projects move closer to reality in certain states. In total, 68 bills touch this category across 24 different states. I'm not going to touch on all of those subcategories today, but we're going to look at the largest two categories more in depth, building regulatory authority and administrative capacity, and studies, task forces, and other planning. Next. All right. So 33 bills focused on building regulatory authority and administrative capacity. These bills are about who regulates carbon management, how it's administered, and whether states have the institutional capacity to oversee it safely and credibly. So these measures clarify permitting authority, establish fee structures, fund agency staffing, or align state programs with federal requirements, in order to obtain things like Class 6 primacy. A subset of states enacted comprehensive carbon management frameworks this year and attacked multiple of those issues at once, including Arkansas, Indiana, Colorado, New Mexico, Michigan, and Ohio. So, in those cases, legislatures weren't just filling gaps, they were putting systems into place that define how carbon storage and related infrastructure will be broadly regulated. Apart from that, the volume of bills in this category suggests that states see governance and regulatory readiness as a prereq to any future deployment. And even where legislatures are hesitant to fund projects directly or mandate certain outcomes, they're still investing political capital in defining authority and roles at the state. So as we approach 2026, this is going to be another area where we're going to see a lot of bills and continued refinement from states that have either previously enacted a pretty comprehensive regulatory suite of policies, or maybe we'll see more bills from those states that did that this year. Next slide. Okay, another governance trend that we saw in 2025 that I want to touch on just briefly is the use of studies, task forces, and advisory bodies. We tracked 12 bills across 10 states that fit this category. And these bills ask questions like, what is our geologic storage potential? Where does direct air capture fit into existing regulatory frameworks? Which agencies should lead and where are the gaps? And overall, the bills focused on information gathering, coordination, and institutional clarity. These measures are generally lower risk for lawmakers and allow them to signal interest or respond to constituent or industry pressure and prepare for future decisions or bills in this category without fully committing to public spending or infrastructure build out. And we didn't see these bills concentrate in one region, they were spread out across the US. And I think in many of these states where these bills were not enacted, again, it shows more beginning curiosity towards carbon management. And we may be more likely to see similar bills be introduced in those states in the future as they consider how they would like to approach the technology. Next slide. All right, I want to zoom out for just a moment here and talk about what all of this means looking towards 2026, not category by category, but across the full landscape of carbon management. The first and most important takeaway that I hit on at the beginning of today's webinar is that interest continues to grow, but enactment remains selective. We're seeing more bills introduced year over year across more states and across more policy dimensions, but that hasn't translated into a proportional increase in bills becoming law. And that gap is telling, and it suggests that legislatures are actively engaging and testing ideas and responding to constituent interest, but they're being careful about what they're ready to commit to. A second shift that we saw pretty clearly in 2025 is that the conversation is moving to should carbon management happen to under what conditions does it happen? And many of the bills introduced this year focused on questions of risk, compensation, authority, and safeguards. Who bears the long-term responsibility? How are landowners treated? And what happens if something goes wrong? And even when those bills don't pass, they're shaping how future legislation is introduced and written. Um, at the same time, another trend is that states remain hesitant to fund carbon management directly. We saw very few enacted bills that commit state dollars outright, and instead we saw states be more comfortable refining eligibility, or using fee-based mechanisms that are tied to project activity to gain revenue for the state. So in 2026, we'll likely see continued policy refinement instead of new state-funded programs. Again, one area where states do appear more willing to legislate is around long-term risk and liability, and I think we can expect that to continue for states to have yet to address the issue. And finally, my last key takeaway here is that community and landowner protections are driving the legislative agenda, even when those bills stall. Eminent domain compensation standards, notice requirements, and emergency preparedness came up repeatedly across states, and we'll likely see that continue to happen into the new year. And with that, next slide here, Alana. Just want to quickly share for those of you that don't subscribe to our legislative digest that you should, and reach out to me or Alana to get subscribed. When session's busy, we send out a digest every single week and share changes to bill status, or any amendments or changes to bills that we see as being high priority. And we'll likely send out our 2026 digest sometime within the next few weeks or so, depending on how bill momentum picks up. So stay tuned for that. Next slide. We also have our legislative tracker. If you're not aware, when you access the tracker, you'll see a map and a sheet with a list of bills. You click on a state to view all relevant legislation. Next. And once you do that, you're able to use filters to search by topic, state, bill status, see our summary, and more. One of the benefits of this tracker is that it updates automatically. So if you don't want to wait for our legislative digest to come out, you can go to the tracker and immediately check on fast-moving legislation or access a link to the state site that the bill is on in case you want to see any particulars there, or in case our site hasn't updated yet. And next slide. Okay, yes. Finally, I just want to invite you to tune into our upcoming webinars. I'll be re-upping the registration link along with our resources and a feedback form after today's webinar. So also please let me know what you'd like to see in the future. Do you want to see more specific presentations on types of bills, or have us explore different categories, more webinars? There's so many options for our team to undertake to provide you with more resources, and we'd love to hear about it. But with that, I think I am at time here, and we can turn to Q&A. Thank you, Alana.
Wonderful. Thank you. Well, thank you for taking these questions on the fly here, and folks who answered questions we didn't get to, we'll definitely follow up with you. Emma, just want to thank you again for walking us through all of this, and I think I'll turn it over to you to close us out today.
Great. Thanks, Alana. Thank you, everyone, so much for joining us today. Please reach out to me with any and all questions. I know I went through this webinar at warp speed, and there's a lot of information and a lot of content there. And I'm more than happy to dig in and discuss a specific bill or a specific state legislation with anyone. So please feel free to reach out. Again, hopefully, sometime in the next couple of weeks, we will be able to share the webinar recording and recap, and would love to hear any and all feedback for what you would like to see in future webinars or next year's webinar when it comes to state legislation. Let's see. Other than that, just again, brief reminder, Alana is going to be spearheading the hydrogen and low carbon procurement webinars in the next couple of weeks here, and those will be fantastic. I'm so excited to tune in and hope that you can join me. So thank you everybody so much for joining and have a great rest of your day.